Hello everybody, welcome back to Fragmented channel. Today's fragment is on the regime. What's in a name? There have been a number of attempts to name that which rules over us. You sometimes hear it referred to as the blob, the New World Order, the cathedral. But in recent years, I've noticed more and more people gravitating towards just referring to it as the regime. I think this is the correct term, and in this video I want to explore what that means a little bit to illustrate the use of this term as an analytical tool. The word regime entered into English from the French phrase l'Ancien Régime, which referred to the political and social order which governed France prior to the French Revolution, and which was overturned and destroyed by that revolution. Due to this origin, the English term means a mode of rule or management, but retains a connotation of illegitimacy or authoritarianism. What's interesting about this word regime is that it might be the best English word to translate a very crucial Greek term used to discuss and analyze political things. That term is politeia. As it happens, politeia is the name of a very famous book by Plato, which we know better by the name given to it in Cicero's Latin translation, namely the Republic. In other words, Plato's book is not about a republic at all, but is about the regime. And by regime, he refers not only to the orders which govern men, but also to the correct way of ordering a human soul. The scholar Alan Bloom is the first I know of in contemporary times who drew attention to this detail in his 1968 translation of the Republic. This is relevant for two reasons. First, several of Bloom's most prominent students from around this era, most notably including Paul Wolfowitz, went on to become prominent neocon advisors to the American government. Second, it was in the years after this that the word regime saw its greatest use in the English language, peaking, as you can see from this graph, in the year 2003. What happened in 2003? Oh yes, the American invasion of Iraq, in which Paul Wolfowitz was a major figure. I recall a number of pieces in the media from around this time speaking in detail of the need to topple the regime of Saddam Hussein. And while the use of this term dropped off a bit after Bush, you can see a little uptick in its use around the time of Brexit and Trump. The graph period ends in 2019. This coincides with a vague memory I have from that era where some Trump-adjacent person referred to our own regime, and a media talking head took exception to this, noting that this word usually means illegitimate governments. In fact, we are governed by a regime, not necessarily in the sense that it is illegitimate, but in the sense that Plato understood it. That is, that there is a politeia which governs and guides social and political affairs. Politeia, the regime, is something much broader than just government. As Bloom notes in his translation, we can refer to a politeia as, figuratively speaking, the soul of the city, something related to the individuals who are part of it in the way that form is related to matter. So think of the flesh and bone and blood, the organs, the atoms that make up your body. While you're alive, while your soul animates it, all of these elements have the form that is you, and they persist in that form. But when you die, that form is no longer retained, and the constituent elements break down. In a similar fashion, you and I and the other individuals that are part of our regime are partly formed by it. We are brought by it into a political order. But the regime is not us, simply speaking. The reason why this is important is because we need to understand that our political order, just like the political order which governed France prior to the revolution, is not natural or necessary or even chosen by us, any more than the arm chooses the soul. And it also does not mean that it is acting in our interests. Ideally, it would, just as the soul in a well-ordered person would not act in a way that harmed the eyes, the heart, the skin, or any other part of the body. but it is not necessary that it do so, as we see gangrenous limbs may be cut off to save the body, or persons with certain mental problems may choose to remove other body parts. Plato, through his characters in the Republic, most notably the philosopher Socrates, but also his own brothers Adeimantus and Glaucon, explores several ways in which regimes operate to control and direct the political orders over which they govern. Law and government are the most influential and significant means of doing this, but education is absolutely crucial, as the modern left well understands, but which the modern right is only just beginning to be aware of. The regime also is operative through the games people play, the art they enjoy, the music they listen to, the stories they tell, because all of these, both in Plato's understanding and in reality, are not simply experiences without meaning. Rather, they act on our souls in different ways. They may habituate us to certain actions. They may induce feelings in us. They may direct our desires towards this or that object. They may fill our imaginations with ideas about what virtue is or what heroism is, and so on. Most people have a limited capacity to reason through things, and therefore the habits that are instilled in them, the ideas that are commonly given to them, or which are implied by the things that they learn, even things that they do just for fun, all of this will go a long way towards directing them. As an example of this, think of the reactions after the election of Donald Trump in 2016. Remember how many people styled themselves as the resistance and likened their situation to those which may be found in Star Wars, Harry Potter, Hunger Games, and other such media. These connections were ubiquitous online and on the lips of people of a certain type. People whose lives revolve around the consumption of such media naturally turn to such media to make sense of their lives, especially in times of stress and trouble. The interlocutors in Plato's Republic observe that many regimes, particularly Athens, take very little trouble over many of these things, allowing people to play games and listen to music, as it were, as the mood takes them. But the argument of that book is that a regime could, and perhaps should, take a more direct hand in these things, being aware that people are formed by the things that entertain them, just as they are also formed by law and by government. In our own time, take a look at children's entertainment programs. What ideas are they insinuating? Do you think such things are without meaning, without influence? Or do they act as extensions of our regime, forming compliant citizens, citizens such as they desire more of? A regime, as Plato understood it, is the cause of men's characters and ways of life. When you see what kind of people surround you and how they live, ask yourself, what is our regime that it produces such people and such lives? I hope this helps to demonstrate the correctness of the term regime for describing our ruling order. Now let's take up the second part of my plan for this video, which is illustrating the use of it as an analytical tool. In the Republic, Socrates and his friends famously create a city in speech, an ideal order, an ideal regime. It's taken for granted that some kind of elite will govern the people of such a city. Plato does not much disagree with elite theorists on this. They hold that, in practical terms, an elite is what governs in human affairs. Socrates devotes considerable attention to the ideal training of this elite, those who are sometimes called the guardians. Two qualities are required of such persons, as any regime would also require of its own guardian class. First, that they must care for the country and be spirited enough to defend it. A regime that cannot be defended against external or internal enemies will eventually be destroyed by one or the other. But the guardians must also have the philosophical qualities of gentleness and even cosmopolitan detachment. Gentleness is required to ensure that they do not tyrannize over the people, and detachment is required so that they feel no need to do so, feeling no desire, for example, to acquire the people's things. The merging of these qualities is likened to what one might find in a good watchdog, who guards over his master's things with ferocity, but does not covet his master's things for himself, and treats the master with love and respect. I need only ask that one describe the qualities of our own ruling class to illustrate their failings. I need only ask, for example, why, across all the countries which are part of our ruling order, it has become progressively more difficult to find volunteers for the military, one of the more visible aspects of our ruling class. Many lack the ferocity or the spirit to defend our order. The defense of the order against external enemies is significantly perverted, one might say. As for the regime's attitude toward internal enemies, they have identified as many as a full third of the population as hostile. This does not seem like a long-term viable situation. Plato uses the idea of the regime as identical to, or at least primarily identified with, the class or the kind of men who hold power there. The way of life is determined by this group. They determine law, education, how property is handled, what marriage is, and even what the family is. Recall how the matter of gay marriage in the United States was resolved. It was resolved by judicial fiat. And note how conceptions of marriage and family are now promoted not only by the government, but even by advertisers, notions which often have nothing to do with what your ordinary person might believe about these things. Look at all aspects of our ways of life today and ask, did these arise organically from the free choice of individuals, or have they been channeled, directed, in some ways chosen, or even given to us by those who hold power? And what of those persons who hold power? What class or what kind of man are they? Before we address that question, I want to highlight an important quality of Plato's approach to political science, which differs from our own. For Plato, there is no such thing as a value-free analysis. In speaking of regimes, we naturally and reasonably compare them to one another, and he does so in the Republic. We judge regimes by comparing them to a healthy order, just as we would judge a soul by comparing it to a healthy human soul. The healthiest regimes would then be those which allow for the development of healthy souls. In a way, Plato's political science is more akin to medicine than it is to mathematics, certainly much more so than our own version of political science. Consider the word regimen, which is etymologically related to regime. Regimen refers to an order followed for the sake of bodily health. We might think of a regime, then, as an order taken for the overall health of a state or a body of men. As a modern example of someone coming to this notion, I think of Peter Turchin's conception of what leads to civilizational collapse. Turchin identifies several factors which, when all are present to a high degree, suggests a significantly increased likelihood of collapse. One of his factors is the very famous notion of an overproduction of elites, meaning an increasing number of people competing for a limited number of offices of power. But another factor is what he calls immiseration. And ultimately, what he is trying to describe here, using modern rather than Platonic language, is an overproduction of unhealthy people. Now, he tries to limit this conception to some kind of measurable physical unhealthiness. But I think at the end of the day, what he really is describing is a proliferation of unhealthy people, meaning not just unhealthy bodies, but unhealthy souls. Just look at the persons who are promoted to positions of power by our regime. And ask yourself this question: are these healthy souls? Are these well-balanced persons? One of the great differences between the ancient and also the Christian conception of a healthy state can be found here. Socrates holds that the difference between healthy and unhealthy soul lies in the mastery of desires. Some pleasures belong to fine desires, as, for example, the pleasure of eating and drinking is related to desires for things we need to live. A man who masters his desires is master of himself, while on the other hand, a man will have as many masters as he has controlling desires. Unhealthy regimes, in the individual person as well as in the state, stem from allowing desires to take control. One may distinguish between different regimes by considering their goals, that is, what kind of desires predominate. In some persons and states, one might say, the desire for honor and recognition is the goal. This was, more or less, the goal of the ancient regime. Note that this is not a healthy state either, but we may put the unhealthy states in a rank order. Next in line would be a state arranged around the goal of acquiring money. The Venetian state was something like this. Some might say this was our own regime, but I don't think this is quite accurate. Instead, it is the one that is next in order, a state arranged around the goal of freedom. That is the state which Plato identifies with the democratic regime. I want to suggest that his discussion of this topic applies not only to his own Athens, but even, mutatis mutandis, to our own regime. So what is a democratic regime? What is a democratic soul? Socrates says that this is the soul of a man who allows all desires to govern him. But rather than be torn apart by them, he survives by allowing now one desire and now another to take over him in succession. And if anyone should tell him that some pleasures belong to fine desires, while others belong to bad ones, and that the one must be practiced and honored, but the other kept in check, he shakes his head at this and says, all desires are alike and must be honored on an equal basis. So Plato. But today, we might say something like, love is love. I have heard people say things like, I don't want to kink shame, which means, in other words, all sexual desires are alike and must be honored on an equal basis. That's pretty much the same idea. In Book 8 of the Republic, Socrates describes how the man with a democratic soul lives. As he puts it, he lives along day by day, gratifying the desire that occurs to him, at one time drinking and listening to the flute, and another downing water and reducing, now practicing gymnastic, and again idling and neglecting everything, and sometimes spending his time as though he were occupied with philosophy. Often he engages in politics, and jumping up says and does whatever chances to come to him. And if he ever admires any soldiers, he turns in that direction, and if it's moneymakers, in that one. And there is neither order nor necessity in his life, but calling this life sweet, free, and blessed, he follows it throughout. He also observes that persons in a democracy become quite tender of soul, such that if anyone proposes anything which sounds like they might have to put their desires in check, they get chafed and can't stand it. Your law's off my body, for example. It ends in their paying no attention to the laws, written or unwritten, in order that they may avoid having any master at all. He also observes that beasts subject to human beings are freer here in a democracy than in any other city. Think of people and how they treat their pets these days. He also observes that there is a disease natural to a democracy as a result of this allowing different kinds of desires to take over. Namely, the disease is the arising of a class of idle and extravagant men. Here, think of celebrities or TikTokers or other such persons. Socrates says that the most spirited men of this class will be leaders, while the rest will be followers. I can't help but think, just as there will be the Kardashians and there will be those who watch Keeping Up with the Kardashians. But there's also another class which arises in a democracy. These are those people who Socrates says are more orderly by nature and who are able to control themselves better than others. These will tend to become rich. In a democratic society, many will be unable to realize, for example, that buying a new car with a payment of over $1,000 a month is a terrible deal when you have a $30,000 a year salary. But they'll buy it anyway. They can't help themselves. Others are better able to control themselves or direct themselves. These will become your Musks, your Zuckerbergs, your Gateses, and so on. But you can imagine it in another type of person too. Think of a great athlete, someone who channels themselves into accomplishing something in the field of athletics, or maybe a military leader of some sort. To this group of people, those who are a little more orderly by nature, therefore richer, to this group, the majority of men will turn the way a bee turns to honey. So, a democratic regime, as Socrates describes it, is comprised, therefore, of three classes or kinds of men. The first are those who appear to us as celebrities or influencers. And the reason why they emerge is because the democratic regime, because of its focus on freedom, is marked by its great variety. These extravagant men illustrate this variety and therefore illustrate the regime. And people enjoy variety naturally. They enjoy seeing it on display. These people seem to be the most free to them, the best exemplars of the regime. So they're fascinated by them. The second class are the ones who become rich. And since by means of money, one is able to enjoy more and more freedom, one also enjoys a certain amount of power, that class is also very important. And in fact, much of politics in a democratic regime involves getting a share of what that class, that second class, makes. The leaders who emerge in a democracy are those who take away the substance of those who have it and distribute it amongst the people, keeping, of course, a share for themselves, often the greatest share. This should all sound quite familiar to us now. A quote from the Republic. Then I suppose that those men whose property is taken away are compelled to defend themselves by speaking before the people and by doing whatever they can. For this, they are charged by the others, even if they don't desire to make innovations, with plotting against the people and being oligarchs. And therefore, when they see that the people are trying to do them an injustice, not willingly, but out of ignorance, and because they are deceived by the slanderers, they at last end up, whether they want to or not, by becoming truly oligarchs. One need only think of the dynamic between the Republican Party as the, quote, party of the rich, but also the party of a certain class of person. That class, namely being those who wish to be left alone, and the Democrats as the party of those who want a piece of their substance, to get a picture of what Socrates is describing here. So Socrates says a lot against democracy in the Republic, but the attentive reader will notice that there's an interesting detail. There's an interesting detail there. He observes that there are men who arise from time to time spontaneously against the will of the regime. These are natures that grow, as it were, by themselves. These are men who are capable of rationality. Let's say that these are men of the philosophical type, namely, men such as Socrates himself. It's made pretty clear that such men do not really have a home or a welcome in a well-ordered city. Men of the philosophical type are most at home in democracies because, although that regime is bad, the pursuit of freedom allows for the free pursuit of different ends, and one of those ends might happen to be philosophy. The philosopher may order his soul properly by mastering his desires, allowing him to pursue his true ends. Now, why does this observation matter for us? It matters because we live in a regime that was born out of a philosophical disagreement, but a disagreement with very specifically the situation outlined by Plato and also carried on by other thinkers as well. The so-called Enlightenment sought to achieve something different than what Plato sought. They sought to develop philosophy, or at least to develop the pursuit of science, or as we might now say, the natural sciences, to a higher degree, with this development being concomitant with an increased power over nature and a relief of the human condition. Democracy, not in the sense of rule by the people, but in the sense of a democratic regime, as Plato described it, the rule of liberated desires over the soul, became the political aim, as the state most conducive to the development of science and scientific men. But such men, think of Richard Dawkins or Steven Pinker as modern examples of this type, they rarely have the wisdom to realize that the state which allows them to pursue science, that is, the state which allows them to pursue reason as they like, is built upon a regime of liberated, irrational desire. Much of what takes place in our regimes today might be understood by reference to this very complicated situation. And I would submit that Plato would better understand it, or Plato in the Republic better understands our own state than either Dawkins or Pinker themselves understand it now, even though they live in it. Let me illustrate with a specific example. Socrates observes that the democratic regime is unstable because the pursuit of freedom necessarily means that one dismiss and eventually entirely ignore the laws. After all, law is a restraint on desire and freedom. The Enlightenment put up the ideal of ordered liberty as a way of avoiding this. In our regime, one aspect of practical politics turns on the dialectic between the demand for freedom and the need to preserve the regime itself. In the 1970s, left-wing approaches to policing produced chaotic situations in many cities, which led to a right-wing law and order response, which curbed some of these excesses. But note that while the right-wing reaction was necessary from the standpoint of preserving the regime, this reaction was denounced and still is denounced when it is enacted again today as fascist. That is, it is denounced by suggesting that it is anti-regime, our regime being founded on freedom, and as one of our founding myths holds, fascism is the opposite. Now consider the development of the phenomenon that is named anarcho-tyranny. This is a state in which some persons, for reasons which may be discussed in another video, are permitted to carry their freedom to a point of almost entire, if not entire, disregard for the law. That is, to carry the logic of freedom to and maybe even beyond the breaking point, while others in society are restricted even to a point that's beyond where they used to be restricted. In other words, tyranny. I believe this situation, the situation of anarcho-tyranny, growing anarcho-tyranny, implies the development of a transition point, such as Plato described, namely the transition point from democracy to tyranny. Because in the Republic, Plato says that democracy is always followed by tyranny, and it necessarily transitions to that. If he's right about that, then what we perceive now as anarcho-tyranny would seem to be the name of a transition state, much like a melting ice cube is in a transition state between the solidity of ice and the pure liquidity of water. Now, why was the democratic state seen as unstable by Plato? The Enlightenment thinkers put some attention to how one could preserve a democratic state. The American founding fathers mentioned that the ancients were aware that democracies were unstable, and they put in various safeguards, which they say are intended to make it more enduring. One of the techniques used post-Enlightenment for making democracy a more stable form of government is rational self-interest. As an example of what I mean, I'll refer to Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which describes this state, which in his view replaced the ancien regime. Men in America, he says, obey not out of a feeling, but out of a quiet and rational persuasion. Law and power, he admits, have lost their majesty and authority, and they may now even be despised. But even if so, men will still obey out of fear, if not out of reverence or love. Fear of imprisonment and fear of loss of liberty is part of this. Another part of this lies in the satisfaction of desires. The regime guarantees the fulfillment of the desires that it also stokes. You get your food, you get your pornography, you get to grill. Why engage in revolution? When you retire, the state is what keeps your retirement checks coming. Are you going to rebel against the hand that feeds? The problem, as Plato knew, is that the nature of desire is to increase. People want more and more. But the nature of an economy as it matures is to provide less and less. Growth becomes more difficult, almost impossible. What happens when the checks stop coming? What happens when there is an external enemy as powerful as oneself? People do not choose to fight and die out of rational self-interest. Sooner or later, a need for sacrifice will arise. The pandemic was one such situation. A war would be another. The answer to this is the parody of reason that we call propaganda, boomer mythology. But this is degrading because any man of sense can see through it and either will avoid it or will know the truth in his heart. At worst, for the regime, such men may actively turn against it. In discussing an ideal state, Plato discusses the ways in which men might be educated who would be more than willing to sacrifice themselves for the state and for their fellow men. In Book 3, Socrates notes, if a man appears hard to bewitch and graceful in everything, a good guardian of himself and the music he was learning. This refers to the system of education, which was described prior to this point in the book. Proving himself to possess rhythm and harmony on all these occasions, such a man would certainly be most useful to himself and the city. And the one who on each occasion, among the children and youths and among the men, is tested and comes through untainted, must be appointed ruler of the city and guardian. And the man who's not of this sort must be rejected. Such men, he goes on to say, guard over enemies from without and friends from within, so that the ones will not wish to do harm and the others will be unable to. Then he asks the question, could we, I said, somehow contrive one of those lies that come into being in case of need, of which we were just now speaking, some one noble lie to persuade, in the best case, even the rulers, but if not them, the rest of the city? And what's the noble lie he has in mind? I'll attempt to persuade first the rulers and the soldiers, then the rest of the city, that the rearing and education we gave them were like dreams. They only thought they were undergoing all that was happening to them, while in truth, at that time they were under the earth within, being fashioned and reared themselves, and their arms and other tools being crafted. When the job had been completely finished, then the earth, which is their mother, sent them up. And now, as though the land they are in were a mother and nurse, they must plan for and defend it if anyone attacks. And they must think of the other citizens as brothers and born of the earth. And he goes on to say that they will be taught that the different places in society consist with natural differences, some men being mixed with gold, others with silver, and others with iron and bronze. Glaucon suggests that such tales are basically impossible to impart to grown men, he reckons, without the power of modern propaganda. But for children and human beings born afterwards, you can convince them of such things. And by means of this passage, Plato shows us why revolutionaries and men who wish to make innovations in the state always turn to the education of children. Because children whose minds are pliable may be fed Phoenician tales of their origin and of what is good and bad. Our own regime teaches children that all men are equal. Inequality is due to racism. The ultimate evil were the regimes of the mid-20th century, and so on. Those myths that are sometimes referred to as the Boomer Truth regime, what are these other than our own regime's version of what Socrates himself admitted was only a story? But I think he shows us another important detail too. People often focus on the justification of social hierarchy, which is part of his noble lie. And indeed, that is important. Though in the story, it's not just used to justify hierarchy, but also to justify natural variations, which otherwise might make no sense. He says, quote, although for the most part you'll produce offspring like yourselves, it sometimes happens that a silver child will be born from a golden parent, a golden child from a silver parent, and similarly all the others from each other. And he goes on to say that the gold must be placed with the gold and the silver with the silver. In other words, the story is also used to justify a certain social mobility based on natural ability. But more important, the first part of the story involves teaching children that they weren't really educated at all, but simply arose by nature as they were. And this, I think, is one aspect of our own regime which is most telling. You sometimes hear it said, for example, that power wants to be seen. While this may be true, it is also true that education specific to a regime wants to disguise itself as nature. In our case, people naturally want to be free. Children naturally rebel against their parents. All men are made up of uncontrolled, irrational desire. Are these things true by nature? Or are these qualities that our regime inculcates in us through its education, and they want us to forget about that? Because if you believe that they're true by nature, you're more likely to accept it. You're less likely to resist it. You're less likely to work against it. Why should one strive for self-mastery, for instance, if all men are naturally ruled by irrational desires? Now hold off on that thought for just a moment. There's another problem which Plato did not envision. What if rational self-interest leads one to oppose the country itself. So the rational self-interest, which was imposed to help make the regime more stable, make it more stable in place of the natural spiritedness which otherwise we might rely on. But what happens when rational self-interest works against the country? This is a phenomenon of the global economy, in which it makes sense to invest in some country halfway across the world because this will produce a greater return on your investment. This is also the phenomenon of the wealthy supporting mass immigration because it means greater control over the regime for themselves, more compliant and more dependent citizens, as well as cheaper labor. Meanwhile, their money allows them to insulate themselves from any negative impact. This is a part of our current condition, and our current set of rulers, their thinking is corrupted by this situation. As one last point of interest, I want to draw attention to one of the biggest differences between the ancient and Christian view versus the modern view. And this lies in the difference between mastery of desire and channeling of desire. So the ancients and the Christians taught that one must master desire, and one might enjoy the pleasures that are licit and avoid those which are illicit. What's the difference between mastering and channeling desire? To understand mastery of desire, you might say to yourself, masturbation is unhealthy for the soul. No fap. Now you'll find that this is most difficult early on because your desires will try to persuade you against it. But over time, it tends to become easier. Week 2 is easier than week 1, and so on. And you'll find that this is true with other things. If you, for example, try to do a fast, your first day fasting will often be the most difficult to get through. Whereas if you get through that day, you might be able to fast for 2 or 3 days more after that. I'm not recommending that anybody do this, but I'm just suggesting that there is a pattern in handling desires where if you approach them from the standpoint of, I'm going to master this, it does become possible. Now, channeling desires. Before we get to that, I want to note that regime media actually spoke against, there's a phenomenon called NoFap November, and regime media actually spoke against it, even speculating that it was the brainchild of online fascists. Now, why would they do that? Perhaps it's because true moderation, as opposed to channeling desires, which is what our regime recommends, makes a man independent of the regime. Channeling of desire works this way. You reason like this. Masturbation is unhealthy, but suppressing desire is also unhealthy. Repression is unhealthy. Isn't that what Freud told us? Therefore, try to masturbate once a day, or maybe only 3 times a week. In other words, masturbate responsibly. Drink responsibly. Enjoy treats in moderation. This is essentially the Enlightenment view of man. We are a mass of unruly desires that cannot be controlled. We can only direct them instead. The state exists for the maximum fulfillment of our desires within an orderly framework. Our states became democracies not in order that the people would truly rule, but because all of us became people enslaved to our desires in the name of experiencing freedom. This is why freedom is so often expressed as a freedom from rather than as a freedom to. Religion and tradition both counseled against this because, according to the religious view, the traditional view, man was understood in a different way. The Enlightenment opposed religion and tradition. They opposed them in the name of saying they were enemies of reason, but what they really were was enemies of liberated desire. This is the unspoken reason for their opposition to these things. Not that they were really unreasoning, but that they conflicted with their view of man as a desiring creature that they wanted to enact. This is also why our societies are nominally capitalist, because capitalism is an efficient system for raising desires in others which they will then pay to have fulfilled. Machiavelli wrote in The Prince that it is perfectly normal and ordinary to wish to acquire. Now, he meant this in political terms, but it also applies in personal terms. Adam Smith agreed, and it is one of the principles of the wealth of nations that men naturally seek to increase their store. The consequences of their views as well as the views of so many others, is the regime as we know it now, a regime which may well be in its death throes. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see everyone again in the next fragment.